When the time comes for our children to grow up and settle down with someone, we can only hope that they choose wisely. But hoping doesn't always work. What happens if they settle down with someone that you wouldn't trust with a barge pole? Today on Money Confidential, how can you keep your hard-earned estate out of the hands of less than ideal in-laws without leaving all your money to a cats and dogs home? We'll be talking family tensions, prenup practicalities, and how not to be a Meghan Markle-style mother or father-in-law. Welcome to Money Confidential with me, Katie Morley. Each episode, I head up and down the country to hear directly from you, lifting the curtain on real-life dramas and delving into stories of financial deception, disputes, and strained relationships. Last week on the podcast, we covered Melanie's story. She was upset at her parents changing their will to favour her brother. More on your response to that episode later. But this week, we're turning the tables and hearing from a couple worried about their wealth being handed down to horrible in-laws. Here's an email sent in, voiced by an actor.
My wife and I are both retired and considering our future. We have an estate of about £2 million and are thinking ahead to our children's inheritance. Sadly, some of them have less than ideal partners. One is simply avaricious and selfish, another just irresponsible, and one is absolutely monstrous. We plan to leave our estate to our children, but how do we keep it out of their partners' hands?
Blimey O'Reilly, this is a tricky one. We're all probably happy enough to hand over our wealth to our nearest and dearest, but what happens when those you're nearest to are far from your dearest? I felt I needed more detail in order to help, so I gave my producer a call. Hi Rachel, it's Katie. How are you?
Oh, hey Katie, I'm good, thanks. How's it going?
Yeah, not bad. I was just wondering if you could tell me a bit more about Malcolm and Penelope. What's going on with them?
Yeah, for sure. So I did have a more detailed conversation with them. And from what I can gather, I think they've got a few different concerns. So they've got several children and everyone's in a slightly different situation. There's some relationships that, to be honest, they don't have a lot of confidence that they'll last. And with others, I think they feel the partner is quite irresponsible. And to be honest, another one just sounds like they're not a very nice person. And they're concerned that they're just in it for the money. So they've kind of got a range of concerns, really.
Yeah, okay. And they ultimately don't want their money that they've worked hard for ending up in the hands of the wrong people. Is that it?
Exactly, yeah. Okay. And, their children are at quite different stages of their relationships as well. So some are married, some aren't. I think one also has children with their partner. So it's quite a sort of range of situations.
Interesting, okay.
And he's never actually spoken directly to his children about the issue. So he's not totally sure how they'd feel about it. He doesn't know what their reaction would be. He thinks that maybe some might react a bit better than others. But ultimately, they feel like they've worked really hard for a long time to build up this wealth. And he and his wife don't want it to be kind of squandered by in-laws or, if the children's relationships don't work out, they don't want all that money to get lost.
Yeah, sounds like a bit of a hornet's nest, though, potentially.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see what we can do.
Great.
All right. Cheers, Rachel. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. See you later. Bye.
So, quite a lot to unpack there. Unfortunately, parents can't prevent their children from sharing money with their partners, no matter how awful they perceive them to be. But if you're determined to leave your assets to your children, what options are out there to protect that money? Especially if your offspring's relationship eventually breaks down. Well, for our listeners' unmarried children, there might be a solution. A good old-fashioned prenuptial agreement. Prenups are growing in popularity, but it can be awkward when it's the parents who are the ones asking for the agreement, which is usually the case. I spoke to someone whose bread and butter is prenups and familial strife. Emma Gill is regional managing partner for top divorce law firm Vardags.
It's really common. People who've worked very hard throughout their lives, they want to pass their wealth down, but don't necessarily want it to go sideways if a marriage fails. I have had a lot of clients over the years who've needed to understand sort of the matrimonial aspect of this when they're doing their wealth planning. And it's something that I find that independent financial advisors or trust lawyers don't really understand. They feel that the sort of traditional methods of, put it in a trust, it'll be protected forever. And that's not the case. What's important is to understand what the landscape looks like on a divorce. And then you can sort of plan backwards from that.
We did delve a little bit further into what the actual situation is here. We know that one of the children is already married. Mm-hmm. We know that one of them has children but isn't married. And we think the other one isn't yet married and doesn't have children. So we've got a couple of different scenarios here. And the word that springs to my mind is prenup. But it seems like it might be too late for one of these kids.
Not necessarily. So the sort of easiest framework is where you've got a couple who are not married and they don't have children together. It's really straightforward because you don't have any rights or responsibilities until you actually walk down an aisle or turn up at a registry office to have either a marriage or a civil partnership. So in those circumstances, providing there's never a marriage and there's never any children, you can leave your wealth without even worrying about it.
Yeah.
Then it gets a little bit more complicated when there's children involved, because under the Children Act, there are financial provisions that are made on behalf of a child. So it would be, in this scenario, the grandchildren. And a weaker financial partner can look to the stronger financial partner to provide them with accommodation on behalf of a child, provide lump sums, provide maintenance or child support. If that's the way that, we'll call it grandma and granddad, had decided to arrange their wealth, then the fact that they have the ability to look to the trust to provide them with resources, you could see that sort of channeling through, and the weaker partner getting the benefit of essentially a provision that's made for the child.
But I'm just going to jump in here and sort of stick up really for these partners. I mean, we've never met any of these people.
I know.
They may well be monstrous and awful, as this person says, but these laws exist for a reason, don't they? And actually, if you have had children with somebody and your marriage goes wrong, isn't it quite right that you have some provision? You are taking care of these children, and maybe it is right that you are entitled to some of that wealth.
Well, you're not entitled to it yourself. The law's really clear on that. This is provision for a child. Looking at it through, grandma and granddad's lens, I imagine that they would be quite happy to ensure that their grandchildren are properly catered for.
Absolutely.
And that actually is a really neat way of sort of getting around this issue of it not falling into that partner's hands, but still making sure that your family, your bloodline are taken care of properly.
And I suppose what I'm referring to is like an indirect benefit. So, if the children will need to be living in a 5-bedroom detached house, and the mother or the father, whichever's not the blood relation of these grandparents, will need to be living in there too to take care of them.
But equally, they're then in a position where when the children are of a certain age, whether that's 18, 21, 25, that their home is essentially taken away from them.
Yeah. So they're out on a limb after that, aren't they?
They are out on a limb. It's a really precarious place to be. And this is all dealt with under Schedule 1 of the Children Act. And it's notoriously tricky. But looking at it through grandma and granddad's eyes, it's quite a neat way of being able to protect your money and make sure that it doesn't go into somebody else's hands that isn't your blood relation.
Gosh, it's also blooming awkward though, isn't it? I mean, talk about fanning the flame.
It is. It's tremendously difficult. And where it gets even more difficult is where you've actually got a marriage. Because once you have exchanged those vows, you then have rights and responsibilities to each other. And that is when portions of wealth are assigned to you in your own right on a divorce, and you're entitled to do with it what you want.
Obviously, a prenup is a way of protecting the assets.
Absolutely.
How do you go about suggesting one and, getting one signed without fanning the flame and making all these relations even more awkward and awful?
I'm just thinking back to one that I did last year, and the way that we did it was to essentially get everybody in the same room, with everybody represented, and explain in the gentlest of ways that this is part of Grandad's wealth planning. It's his money. If he wanted to leave it to the cats and dogs home, he could. He may well decide to do that. But in moving forward, what everybody wants is certainty and clarity, and indeed projecting forward even further, proper care for children as they come along.
I mean, I've never signed a prenup, but, if I was sat down in a room like that, I would think, God, they must hate me. But is it, do these situations usually arise in your experience where there is some ill feeling, or can it be the case that this was something they were always going to do anyway and it's got nothing to do with the relationship?
Absolutely that. I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's because there's actually really good relationships between everybody. And there's open and honest discussions, because there's layers to this. You've got the relationship between parent and child. As I say, it's the parent's money. They've earned it. Then you've also got the relationship between the couple themselves. And in my experience, the majority of people would rather have the money and be able to use it during their marriage. And yes, we'll sign an agreement that says how that's regulated if we divorce, rather than not have the money at all.
What happens when, the respective partner really kicks off and says, stamps their feet and says, this isn't fair. I'm not happy with this. I'm not doing it.
It's one of two things. Either everybody goes back to the drawing board and there's a renegotiation, or marriages don't happen. And as we've already discussed, without a marriage, the financial landscape is really, really different for the weaker financial party.
And when you say go back to the drawing board, what could happen there?
It's a commercial negotiation, as you would if you were, discussing everything. Everything has got a number that people can coalesce around.
So they might say, well, I'll sign it if I can have 100k.
Exactly. Well, 9 times out of 10, it would always be more than 100k.
Yeah,
absolutely. Because this is a really important thing about prenups that I think is a really common misconception, is that they're somehow a steamroller that pushes the weaker party into a corner and they get nothing, in a really sort of, Machiavellian way. The best prenups are actually pretty generous.
Right.
What they do is give everybody certainty.
A £2 million estate, although it's very big, it's not maybe enough to leave 3 divorced partners with a mortgage-free house, is it? While providing for the actual children.
That's very true. If Granny and Grandad were sat in front of me, I would be suggesting to them that they'd look at setting up some sort of trust that is then backed up with a prenuptial agreement to limit claims. Because a trust just standing there on its own, potentially you've got an open attack. Because if you've got Granny and Grandad's children, their blood relations as beneficiaries, and indeed grandchildren as beneficiaries, even if you exclude the spouses, that's still a resource that a court can look at.
And how does a trust work? What's the benefit of a trust?
Essentially what you're doing is you're taking an amount of money and putting it into a separate entity, which is run by independent people who have to act in the best interest of that trust. So writing a cheque to somebody for £100,000 so that they can go to the 210 at Cheltenham isn't a great idea for the trust. But giving somebody £100,000 as a deposit for a house, which is then part owned by the trust, is. So it's another mechanism, very tax efficient mechanism of thinking about your inheritance planning. But without a prenup to back it up, prenups are not just for the mega wealthy. I think what we really need to understand is that prenups are there to give certainty. That's their aim. It isn't to squash a weaker party. And everybody can, need certainty at a time of turbulence, which is what happens when divorce happens.
If these people came into your office today and asked you for advice on how they should proceed with this, what would you say to them?
The first thing is to understand what their relationship is like with their children. And what their intentions are. Do they intend to pass down the entirety of the 2 million? Is everybody just getting £100,000 each? The second thing is, what do you think your children will do with that money? Because if that's going to be invested, and you're absolutely right, Katie, £2 million sounds enormous. But essentially, if that's going 6 ways with a family that live in central London, it's not actually going that far. So let's say for round figures, it's going to be £500,000 each to the children and 500,000 is going to the cats and dogs home. If they're investing that £500,000 and it's going to go into their primary residence and they're married, then it's very, very unlikely that a court would say, even I think with a prenuptial agreement that wrote somebody out of the family home, I think it's very, very unlikely that that would actually find favour with a court.
Right. And if the children are middle-aged, likely that they're mortgaged up to the eyeballs as well. So they're going to want to be paying that off, aren't they?
So if the mortgage goes, particularly if the property's in joint names, whether they're married or not, actually, then those partners are going to take the benefit of it. But I think it's also about then think about, well, what do you want to achieve? Is protection of this money the absolute utmost, or is it actually having a relationship with your children?
Exactly.
You know, you can understand why somebody would want to hold on to it. But is that how you want to spend the rest of your life? And not to put too fine a point on it, are you going to be concerned about what happens after you've passed away?
There's more than one partner here, and none of them are good enough for this couple. What is going on here? I wonder what the relationship with the children are like.
Yeah. A good family lawyer will always be alive to the fact that these are commercial deals, but they're wrapped in emotion. They are wrapped in relationships.
Yeah. And when you're in a room with these people, how long does it kind of take you to get a sense of the complex family dynamic that's going on?
Usually about 3 minutes. It's really obvious. I've been doing this an awful long time though, so I think I've got a better radar than most.
You've got a good nose for it.
Got a good nose for trouble.
Go on then, what do you think's going on here then?
I suspect that Christmas is on the horizon. Everybody's thinking about what it's going to be like when everybody gets together, because there'll be one partner who drinks too much at Christmas and is a bit vocal. There'll be one who does substandard roast potatoes. And then the monstrous one probably buys dreadful gifts for everybody. That'll be on everybody's mind. And it's, we laugh, but as a divorce practitioner, my peak times are January and September, because there are those crunch points. Oh, family holidays in the summer, family holidays at Christmas, where everybody getting together, bit too much wine, bit too much downtime.
It's a recipe for a row, isn't it?
Recipe for drama.
And they say, is it 3rd of January that's like National Divorce Day or something?
I think it's the next week. I think it's 10th.
So going into this tense Christmas period, what's your best advice for the family? How can the children, how can their partners, how can these grandparents all get together at Christmas and not erupt?
I think it's really important that everybody understands where the boundaries are, and that money isn't something that's up for discussion, and Christmas is a focus for people getting together, and therefore, oh, well, I've not seen Dad, so whilst I'm with him face to face, I'm going to raise this. Raise it beforehand.
So don't raise prenups at Christmas.
Do not raise prenups at Christmas. Raise them in November. When they're signposted, it's ventilated. Do it on a Zoom call. You don't need to be doing this face to face. But I think what's really, really important is to understand what your objective is. And if it is about controlling your wealth once you voluntarily decide to pass it down, yes, there are things that you can do, but it's limited because you're giving away, you are making a conscious decision to give away your wealth.
And would you address it with all the kids at the same time so they don't feel sort of marked out?
Yes, I probably would actually. Call a family meeting, bite the bullet and do it now so that actually you can have a restful Christmas period rather than this feeling of anticipation building up. It may be that the blood relation children haven't got any idea that this is going on.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure they haven't. Yeah, exactly. It's existing in their heads at the moment. And it costs nothing to do a Zoom call, does it? So
absolutely.
They could do that.
Live it live, ventilate it.
And they could do that before even seeking any legal advice, couldn't they?
It's probably always better to get just a little bit of advice can go a long way, just to understand where this actually fits together in terms of your plan.
Right.
Because there'll be multiple advisors, even for a £2 million sum, you will have financial advisors, you will have accountants, you probably need tax advice, and you will need, potentially a private client lawyer, which is different to a family lawyer. I'm not saying you need all of that at once.
Can I ask how much your services would be for something like this?
It would be somewhere between, because the estates that I deal with really are all over 10 million. So my cost would be somewhere between probably 10,000 and 50,000 plus that, depending on what I needed to do.
Sure.
I am a big believer that nothing is worth your relationship with your children, albeit my daughter is 9 and is delightful. So that may change as she reaches adolescence and adulthood. But I think the real question to ask is, what do I want from this?
Yeah. And actually, these children might be really happy with these partners.
They might be delighted.
They
might already have prenuptial agreements in place that their parents don't know about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's between the individuals. They may say, for example, one of these parties had made a lot of money early in their career and got married in their early 30s. There could be a prenup already in place to protect that.
Yeah, good point.
I see that more and more frequently. It's people who are on their second marriage for whatever reason want to protect what they bring in. So there may be agreements in place that nobody knows about.
It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. And yeah, we just wish these guys well and hope that they manage to get through Christmas without throwing turkey at each other.
Fingers crossed. And if not, I will be in the office on the 27th of December.
Many thanks to Emma Gill from Vardag Solicitors. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this episode, we've had a tidal wave of response and reaction to last week's inheritance episode. For those that missed it, Melanie wrote to this podcast, upset that her parents, who are still alive, have changed their will to favour her brother, who has a partner and 2 kids, whereas she has no partner and only 1 child. Oof, you had a lot to say. Janet said, perhaps a fairer way to leave an inheritance to the family would be to specify the same sum to each grandchild and then allocate any residual estate equally between the children, in this case Melanie and her brother. Bill said, is it justified to treat siblings unequally when it comes to money and inheritance? In my view, it's impossible to avoid doing that. I regret I cannot offer any advice to Melanie, except that perhaps she should lighten up and enjoy what she has. Well, easy to say, isn't it? Annabelle says, the letter says Melanie only came home twice a year from boarding school, so I wonder where the family lived, as some countries are very old-fashioned about female equality. The desire of the parents to help all the family must be accepted. It is their will, and the money could have been given to a charity if they so wished. Nobody has a right to inherit. Well, that's quite right. Thank you to everyone who wrote to moneyconfidential@telegraph.co.uk. We were overwhelmed with emails and opinions, and we'll air more in a future episode, as well as returning to the topic in a future series. Coming up after the break, I'll be digging deeper into Malcolm and Penelope's dilemma with Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant. Back in a mo. Welcome back to Money Confidential with me, Katie Morley. Now, our listener is facing a tricky situation. How can he protect his estate from his children's partners? But more importantly, how can he have the conversation without damaging the relationship with his children? Joining me now is Madeline Grant from The Telegraph to help me sort through this.
Malcolm and Penelope I find quite interesting because obviously they have 3 children, and all 3 of the children they deem to have made such unpleasant choices with who they marry that they're worthy of, basically ostracism from the family. And it sort of reminds me slightly of the Meghan Markle effect, where it's like, what's more likely? Is it that every single member of Meghan's family, apart from her mother, literally everyone that she is related to, all of them are such terrible people that none of them get invited to her wedding? Or could the problem possibly have something to do with Meghan herself?
Could they be looking in the mirror for the solution, maybe?
Yeah.
It's an interesting point. It's an interesting point that you raise, and it has crossed my mind as well. It's quite coincidental that they're all wrong-uns, isn't it?
I mean, I'm very lucky because all 3 of my siblings have wonderful partners So there've been no complaints on that front. But, there's always going to be disagreement in a family. That's natural. To have such irreconcilable differences that can't be resolved with, the usual family diplomacy is quite an extraordinary thing. It's a very sad thing, actually. It's really sad for a family to be divided in that way.
Some people call them like the mill and dill, mother-in-law and father-in-law dynamic can be challenging, even in very harmonious families, can't it?
I mean, sometimes there's a difficulty where, let's say, the in-laws happen to live much closer to their child and their grandkids, so they get to see more of them, like who gets them for Christmas. Sometimes when children come along, there can be a bit of that. But on the whole, most people realise, I think, that there is a greater good that is the kind of family harmony, and that sometimes you have to let small things slide because the bigger picture is far more important. The thing that struck me was that Malcolm and Penelope haven't, they've kind of moved ahead to step 3. You know?
Cut them out the will.
Exactly.
They're already foreseeing the divorces and the separations on the horizon, aren't they? But I think you're right. It's kind of like, why don't they take a step back and think, how can we bring them in?
Is it possible that they don't particularly like the in-laws, but we're English. We don't always have to make our feelings abundantly clear at all times. People, I'm sure there are many families where there's not particular affection on both sides, but both sides are able to maintain a kind of veneer of politeness and pleasantry, so that, for example, the grandkids can grow up happy knowing both sides of their family. There are bigger things that are worth making that sacrifice for.
Now, we've just heard from our wonderful legal expert about the world of prenups. Is this something that you've ever heard of? Have you ever signed a prenup, Maddie?
Well, I got engaged recently.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you so much. The idea of a prenup hasn't occurred to me, perhaps because the sums of money involved are so small. There would be no point. But I've always thought of prenups as a very American thing, and also something that the super rich would do.
Yeah.
But it strikes me that you shouldn't go into a marriage thinking on those terms, but perhaps that's naivety on my part. Perhaps in 10 years' time, when I'm having an acrimonious divorce and I haven't got a pot to go in, should we say, then I'll come back to you, Katie, and say, what was I thinking? But it won't come to that.
Well, we'll have a chat in 20 years and see where we're both at there. But if you were going to go down this road, it strikes me, as you say, it's not terribly British to be talking in this way anyway. But yes. Could it not sour relations even more if you're not careful? I mean, I've never signed a prenup either, but I don't know how I would feel.
But then there are terrible marriages. People do terrible things. The person that you've married turns out to be someone completely different. I remember my parents telling me a story of a couple. I think they knew, or perhaps it was an urban myth couple that they heard about. But the wife was cheated on terribly, and the husband betrayed her in the most egregious way. And she ran around the neighbourhood. He collected vintage wine, and so she drives around the neighbourhood just giving out vintage bottles of vintage wine to all the neighbours.
Revenge.
But I think it does set quite I don't know, if my fiancé said, I think we should have a prenup, I'd feel quite hurt by that. Would you have felt hurt if your husband had said, let's have a prenup?
I think I probably would. But as our legal expert has just said, there is a way of doing it in a slightly more tactful way, let's just say. And she sort of says that the best prenups are done in a way that lets the other party know that actually they are going to be provided for whatever happens to an extent.
Yes.
But to an extent is the key there. And actually, as you said before, that normally applies to like super rich families that have the ability to do all that. And as hard as Malcolm and Penelope have worked for their £2 million estate, which is not insignificant in any way, shape or form,
no.
But I wouldn't class that as super wealthy, and probably not enough to kind of do that tactic in a prenup, if you like. But I think they could definitely take that sentiment on board, don't you think?
I think in the UK, people do have more leeway about leaving their money away from their children, don't they?
Yeah.
I think in France, it's impossible not to leave it to your children. In England, if somebody does want to leave the money to the donkey sanctuary or whatever, then they can go ahead and do that. There often seem to be family disputes where, let's say, there was an older person who perhaps had Alzheimer's or was not at the top of their mental faculties. And then there is some dispute when, let's say, a lot of money is left to their carer. There have been a few cases like this recently.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Where it's been disputed by the children.
Yes. I mean, so if it really mattered that much to them, for example, would they be able to leave it only to their grandchildren and bypassing their children altogether and the partners they don't like?
So I think the issue with that is that not all of the children have children of their own. So it's like, how do you make it fair? Inheritance is such a difficult one because, your loved ones want to be treated fairly and your will needs to reflect that. But here they seem to be wanting the children and the grandchildren to benefit, but not the partners, so only the bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually don't know how realistic that even is.
No, if you've inherited money from your parents and they're gone, they're pretty dead, aren't they? They can't tell you how you're to spend that money.
Yeah, and it's your decision who to spend your life with as well. So if you decide to marry somebody, then that's part of you, I think.
It's very complicated. It sort of reminds me of almost what they want is those kind of very complicated wills that you read about in Victorian novels, where it's like entailed away from someone, like in Pride and Prejudice.
Well, one simple solution would be leave it all to the cats and dogs home, wouldn't it?
I think what really rankles in families where wills are concerned is actually not necessarily where the money is left to, but if there is any disparity between siblings. I've heard of families where even sometimes they leave more money to one of their children because, let's say, that child hasn't made as much money, is financially comfortable. And the other children, even if they've earned more, are wounded because they take that to mean they love me less.
Yeah.
But even if there's quite a logical reason for it, it can still really hurt families and divide people.
Exactly. And we heard about that on last week's episode, actually. And it really hurts. Finally, Maddie, your advice to Malcolm and Penelope, what would you do in their shoes?
Try a period of non-aggression to try and be nicer, be more active in trying to get on with these in-laws. I'm sure we all have people in our lives that we have to be polite to for whatever reason. I mean, I obviously love all my colleagues at the Telegraph, but not everyone loves everyone that they, for example, have to work with or see socially. Sometimes your friend will go out with someone that you're not enamored of, but you still want to keep that friend, so you're polite. Like, can they not find it in their hearts to at least be civil to these in-laws? When it comes down to it, however much people love their parents, if the parents are horrible to their spouse, I think a lot of partners will say that's not on and ultimately choose the spouse who is the person they're going to spend the rest of their life with and potentially the mother or father of their children.
It's such a tricky one, though. I feel for them in some ways, but, it's all about perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
Give them a chance, Malcolm and Penelope.
Maybe consider that if you hate all three of them, that statistically the problem may in fact be you.
So, an interesting analysis there from Madeline Grant. I wonder what Penelope and Malcolm will think. I hope that's shed some light on the situation for them, though. All is fair in love and war, but when it comes to money, maybe get a prenup first. If there's something you want to get off your chest, email me at moneyconfidential@telegraph.co.uk or fill in the form via the link below. It takes about 60 seconds and can be totally anonymous. And a lot of fun. Typey. Thank you for listening to Money Confidential. Please do help grow the show by rating on your podcast app and leaving a nice review. You can find me on Instagram at moneybackmorley. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Briggs. Sound design and mixing by Elliot Lampett. And the series producer is Giles Gear. Ta-ta for now, sausage!